us, and I think we're going to go ahead and get started. You are here for the webinar on SEC FAST Act cover page tagging update. So this has been a hot topic of late, and we appreciate everybody joining us in the final days before the holiday weekend. And I'm just going to go straight in and show you who our speakers are and the agenda today. We are happy to have with us today two great speakers. We have Jay Knight, who is a partner at Bass, Berry & Sims. He is the leader of the capital markets subgroup at Bass, Berry. We also have Brian Castrantis. Brian is a senior manager at Ritchie May & Company. Brian's been involved in XBRL for many, many years in different capacities. So what we're going to be covering today is Jay is going to lead us through some background on the SEC rule. And then we're going to go through some Q&A of some questions that you all have submitted and some what we see as really common questions that a lot of people have been asking. We'll then cover a couple of CPE questions. I think everyone knows that we are offering CPE for this program. So if you signed on to get CPE, or if you'd like to get CPE, but even if you didn't sign on, make sure that you respond to the questions as they're asked, as the polls come up, and then we'll record your message. Or record your responses rather. Next, we'll cover tagging in Inline XBRL, and so Brian is going to give us a kind of a technical update on the latest on tagging using for cover page tagging, and then finally we'll follow up with some CPE questions and then some upcoming events and programs from XBRL US. Just a couple of logistical points. If anybody has any problems with audio or visual access during the program, please send us an email at support, S-U-P-P-O-R-T, @xbrl.us, and we'll do our best to get you back up and online. Also, I mentioned the CPE, so make sure that you respond to the poll questions as they come up if you're getting CPE. And then finally, if you do have questions as we go through the program, just click on the Q&A link at the top of your screen and you can submit your questions. Our audience is all on mute, and only the presenters have audio access so that we can minimize any kind of outside volume. So with that, I'm gonna go to our next slide, and I'm gonna turn it over to our first speaker, Jay Knight. Jay?
Thanks, Michelle. Appreciate the opportunity to participate in the webinar. I know this is certainly a hot topic that a lot of our clients have been addressing over the past month, in particular during Q season for most of our companies, and certainly a lot of questions and guidance from the staff that have been helpful. Just by way of background, I'm a corporate and securities partner at Bass, Berry & Sims. We're a law firm of about 300 lawyers, primarily in Nashville, D.C., and Memphis. I joined Bass, Berry in 2012 after having served about 5 years at the SEC's headquarters in their division of corporation finance, and then at a firm prior to that. So kind of starting off on slide 3, in March of this year, the SEC adopted new rules with the goal to modernize and simplify certain disclosure requirements in Regulation SK. And the goal was really to try to reduce the costs and burdens to registrants while continuing to provide material information to investors with the goal of improving readability and navigability of disclosure documents. By and large, I would say that the rules have been very well received by companies, and particularly on the other pieces of rules that are not really cover page data requirement that we're talking about today, but all the other ones have been fairly well received. Michelle, if you want to move to slide 4. The specific SEC rule was titled FAST Act Modernization and Simplification of Regulation SK. I know it rolls off the tongue really well. It was first proposed for comment in 2017, and then the final rules were adopted in March 2019, along with cover page tagging, which I would probably say is one of the key parts of the rulemaking. But other very important parts of the rulemaking were greater flexibility when filing exhibits under 601. For example, schedules and exhibits to material contracts can now be omitted in most cases. That was a pretty welcome change. There's a much simpler process for redaction of confidential information and a much expanded hyperlinking requirement. And if you're interested in learning more about these other changes in the rules, our firm did a webinar on these topics in early May, and you can listen to those audio recordings for free on our securities blog, which is bassberrysecuritiesLawExchange.com. Turning to slide 5, Michelle. As many of you know, the current rules require operating company registrants to file their financial statements as an exhibit in a machine-readable format using XBRL. For domestic registrant disclosure forms, the XBRL data tagging requirements are imposed through Item 601B101 of Regulation SK and Rule 405 of Regulation ST. For foreign private issuer disclosure forms, those analogous XBRL data tagging requirements are in the forms themselves. The XBRL filings are required as an exhibit to periodic reports and Securities Act registration statements, as well as reports on Form 8K and 6K that contain revised or updated financial statements. In 2018, the SEC took the next step in XBRL and adopted rules requiring the use of Inline XBRL. And Inline XBRL, as many of you know, is where the XBRL data is embedded into the HTML document instead of the traditional XBRL format. Prior to the most recent amendments, registrants must also tag in XBRL a specific group of data points on the cover page of the filing. These specific data points, which are tagged according to Regulation ST in the Edgar Filer Manual, are known as document and entity identifier elements, and include, among other things, form type, company name, filer size, and public float. As the SEC in their adopting release noted, this information corresponds to some, but not all, of the information that registrants are required to include on the filing page, on the filing cover page. For example, the 10K contains about 25 data points, according to the SEC's adopting release, and prior to the new rules, less than half of those were required to be tagged. So kind of moving on to the rules were adopted in March. They now require that all of the information on the cover page of Form 10K, 10Q, 8K, 20F, and 40F be tagged in Inline XBRL in accordance with the Edgar Filer Manual and on the compliance dates that are listed there on slide 5. The SEC added a new term called Cover Page Interactive Data File that's in Rule 11 of Regulation ST, which is the definition provision of Regulation ST, which defines this term as the machine-readable computer code that presents the information required by Rule 406 of Regulation ST. As noted on slide 5, the compliance dates for the updated cover page tagging requirements are the same as the inline filing requirements that were adopted in 2018, and those are listed on the slide. But just for for the avoidance of doubt, those compliance dates begin for large accelerated filers using GAAP. Those are already in effect. So there was the first periodic report for fiscal period ending June 15th, on or after June 15th, 2019. For accelerated filers using GAAP, that's June 15th, 2020, and then for all other filers, it's 2021 as outlined there. And then filers were required to comply beginning with their first 10Q filed for fiscal period ending on or after the compliance date. So, for example, these large accelerated filers that just went through this schedule, it was required on the first 10Q. So, the normal cadence, you'd file your earnings release on an 8K. And then the Q following, the 8K before the 10Q would not need the cover page tagging, just the 10Q, which would be the first filing that would be required to have inline cover page tagging. We can move to slide 6, Michelle. In connection with the cover page tagging requirements, the SEC also took this opportunity to update the cover page information, just to kind of synchronize with the information data gathering that they were going to be doing. And so they updated the cover pages of 10K, 20F, and 40F, which already required the disclosure of title of each class of securities registered under 12B of the Exchange Act and each exchange on which they are registered, to also include the trading symbol. And in connection with this, they also basically copied and pasted this table that's listed on slide 6 onto Forms 8K and 10Q, so that basically all the forms, Exchange Act forms that are kind of periodic and current reporting, will have this information to synchronize across the platform. The other thing that's noted here is that Form 10K was also updated to remove the prior box related to Section 16 delinquent reports, which, as a practitioner, it was pretty poorly drafted and hard to understand. It was like a negative inference of their Section 16 filing. So that was just a kind of welcome cleanup. Moving on to slide 7, we're going to discuss some common questions, and I think, Michelle, you're going to read those off? Yep.
Jay, thanks very much for the review of the rule and specifically the cover page tagging portions of it. We have seen a lot of questions coming in about this topic and about the rule in particular. And I think one of the questions a lot of people have is, what do I do when I have questions? If I don't have a Jay Knight to reach out to. So one question I want to ask is, which SEC office is responsible for answering cover page questions? We often, here in the XBRL world, we often turn to DIRA, but you can probably elaborate on that more. Which SEC office is responsible for answering cover page questions?
Sure, and this is a tricky one as well, and I can appreciate how difficult it is. I used to work at the staff, and sometimes it's challenging to figure out which person to call in which office. So for Edgar questions like this in the cover page tagging, if it's a technical question, probably some of the stuff that Brian's talking about today, that would usually go to the Edgar business office, which is actually under the umbrella of the Chief Operating Officer at the SEC, and otherwise that's also known as the Edgar Filer Support. The number's on the website, and they handle a lot of kind of technical questions like that. Or you mentioned DIRA as well. For kind of interpretive legal questions related to XBRL and specifically related to the cover page or some of the inline XBRL, if it's kind of a technical, if it's more of an interpretive legal question, the office to call is the Office of Chief Counsel in the Division of Corporation Finance for operating company registrants. So, for example, whenever I had called the staff a number of times to get guidance on behalf of clients and others in connection with these rule implementation questions, and I spoke to both of those offices, and they were coordinating with each other. Ultimately, the Chief Counsel's office was the office that pushed out the SEC interpretive questions. Like, does 8K apply to all? Does cover page tagging apply to all 8Ks, and just the various C&DIs that were posted that many of you all are familiar with. So those are the two offices that I would primarily call.
Great, thank you. And the next question, refers specifically to Form 8Ks. There's lots of different types of Form 8Ks. And does the cover page tagging apply to all Form 8Ks, or maybe just to those with financial information? What's the appropriate approach?
Well, this is a good question. The SEC provided confirmation that yes, indeed, the cover page tagging does apply to all 8Ks, not just those 8Ks with financial statements where you would have the Exhibit 101 for the financial statement XBRL filing. So the cover page tagging does apply to all. There is, and we'll talk about this in a moment, an exception about whether or not you have to identify that in the exhibit index, but just as a practical matter, you will be tagging all 8Ks in accordance with the compliance dates for your registrant.
Okay, great. Okay, the next question refers to companies that previously were not required to file in XBRL. Do these companies have to continue to have a complete exemption? Do they tag only the cover page with Inline XBRL, or do they start completing the tagging with Inline, just like other companies?
So the answer there is that they will, the cover page tagging requirements coincide with the registrant's existing compliance phase-in period for Inline XBRL. So the rules that were adopted in March won't, cause a company to have to cover page tag a file if they're not otherwise required to do Inline XBRL. So to the extent that, like, they're an accelerated filer, they have an exemption for Inline XBRL until next year, then they can continue to do what they're doing now, and just comply with cover page tagging once the full Inline XBRL comes on.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, now I think we're going to get into some questions specifically about exhibits. And we actually just got a question from the audience saying, can you touch base on requirements surrounding Exhibit 104? Maybe you can start off with, what is Exhibit 101 and what is Exhibit 104? Because I think there's a lot of confusion around those.
Sure. So Exhibit 101 is the interactive data file. As many of you know, that's really related to financial statements. And so whenever you would have financial statements in an 8K or in all your 10Qs and 10Ks, you will have the 101s because there's financial statements attached. The 104 exhibit is really the one that's probably caused the most headache for companies lately. It's just because it's not actually an exhibit file. It's it's related to the cover page interactive data file, and for 10Qs and 10Ks, it's clear the Edgar Filer Manual says that you satisfy your Exhibit 104 filing through the filing of 101. You wouldn't have a separate Exhibit 104 filing, but that really the key distinction between the two is 104 is the cover page interactive data file, and 101 is your traditional XBRL file for financial statements.
Okay, and to some extent, I think you answered. Maybe just to clarify a little bit about where exactly are these two exhibits used?
Right. So the Exhibit 101s are filed in registration statements as well as Exchange Act reports when the issuer financial statements are provided. And Rule 405 of ST has the details about that. And then the cover page interactive data files under Exhibit 104 are filed with Exchange Act reports, periodic and current reports, but not with the registration statements. And Rule 406 of ST is the applicable rule for a cover page.
Okay, great. And then since there has been quite a bit of confusion on this, there may be some companies that have already submitted their Inline XBRL cover page tagging. What happens to those issuers that submitted an Inline XBRL filing that did not reference Exhibit 104? Do they need to do something?
Yeah, well, the good news here is I don't think that there's anything that needs to be done. I think you just, going forward, need to correct it. I've had informal discussions with the staff. This is not a high priority. I would not expect a comment letter. There's no amendment that's necessary. If you otherwise have an amendment, I would fix it. But this alone does not cause the filing to be materially deficient. So at this point, I would just make sure that it's correct in your next filing that would include it.
Okay, that's great. That's good to know. And then, kind of following on that, do issuers have to reference the Exhibit 104 in every Form 8K? And we actually got kind of a companion question to that just coming in from our audience. Do we need Exhibit 104 in 8Ks when there is no financial data?
Yeah, and this is the one. This is one in particular where I had quite a bit of discussion with the staff because they were wrestling with the issue as well about how to treat it and whether or not to come out with a practical answer. And I mean, the rules require, like I said earlier, an Exhibit 104 in all exhibits. In all 8Ks. But the question is, do you lose the benefit, the value of a 901 item of 8K when, if you require a 104 exhibit in every single 8K, it really doesn't inform investors when there's actually a filing, because a filing exhibit, because as you know, like with an 8K, the exhibit 104 is really just, it's embedded within the file, Inline XBRL file itself. There's not a separate attachment. And so what the staff came out with was some guidance that says, it takes a practical approach and basically says that if the exhibit index of a Form 8K would include only Exhibit 104 and would not include any other exhibit, the staff will not object if the registrant does not add an exhibit index to the Form 8K solely for the purpose of identifying the cover page interactive data file as an Exhibit 104 under Item 901. And so, if the 8K does not otherwise have an Exhibit 104, the 8K does not otherwise have an exhibit that's being filed outside of an Exhibit 104, then you don't have to separately just include an Exhibit 104 reference in a Item 901. To the extent you do have an exhibit. Otherwise, for example, you have a material contract that's being filed under Exhibit 10. Then, in that situation, you would go ahead and include the Exhibit 104. I know that creates a little bit of headache to, kind of monitor compliance, but that does help around the edges to minimize having a 901 item on every single 8K.
Right, and then some other questions that we've just received. Actually, do you want me to move to the next slide to show what it would look like, Jay?
Sure. Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry. This is another question. I forgot about this one. What should be listed on a Form 8K when there are exhibits attached? When there are other exhibits attached?
Okay, so in that situation, you would include a reference to Exhibit 104 in the Item 901 disclosure. And so what you would say, and your next slide 9 is going to show an example from a 10Q, but on an 8K setting, you wouldn't make a reference to an Exhibit 101 because in most cases on an 8K there will not be a separate Exhibit 101 without financial statements. So what you would just include is, and we include this on our blog on an FAQ, an example of what you can include, but basically you'd have Exhibit 104, you put cover page interactive data file, and then we just had a parenthetical that starts embedded within the inline XBRL document in parenthetical. So you're just noting that there is an Exhibit 104, there's a cover page interactive data file, and then you're just noting that that's embedded within the document itself. There's not a separate filing, and you're not referencing a separate Exhibit 101.
Right. So here's this example that you put together.
Right. So this is an example from a 10Q from a large accelerated filer. So they have the traditional Exhibit 101 references. The Edgar Filer Manual makes clear that in this instance, your Exhibit 1, you satisfy your 104 obligation through filing it embedded within your 101. And so that's why this one says cover page interactive data file formatted as inline XBRL and contained in Exhibit 101. So this is an example of what you would include on a 10Q or a 10K.
Okay. Okay, great. And we're getting a lot of questions, but I think they're a little bit of just a variation on the same topic. Let's see. if there's no financial data in an 8K, then only Exhibit 104 is required and not 101. I don't think that's correct.
So if there's no financial data on an 8K, then you would not otherwise have a 101. You would then the analysis depends on, is there any, you would always have for the 8K, you would always have the cover page tagging embedded in the inline XBRL if the company is otherwise subject to it. I guess the analysis then is, do I have to actually disclose Exhibit 104 in an exhibit index? And if there's no other exhibits but for the Exhibit 104, then you don't have to make a separate reference to 104. You only have to make a reference to 104 if there is other exhibits already going to be included on the 8K.
Right, so you kind of have two situations. One where if the 8K includes an exhibit index, then you reference 104. If the 8K does not include an exhibit index, then you don't need to reference 104. I mean, I assume you can if you want to, but you don't have to. Would that be
exactly
accurate?
That's correct. Right. Yeah.
Okay.
You can always voluntarily include, or not voluntarily. I mean, you can always reference Exhibit 4 in every 8K if you like, but then the value of item 901 is lessened because investors don't really know if there's an actual exhibit being filed or if it's just kind of a 104 cover page tagging.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm just looking at questions we're getting in here. Okay, let's go on to our next set of questions here. This is related to timing, and I know this was a big topic of concern, early on. Hopefully some of this has been straightened out a little bit, but the first question, what does it mean to early adopt inline XBRL compliance? Because we hear that phrase a bit.
Sure. So early adoption just means you're choosing to adopt the inline XBRL requirements before the applicable compliance date that we discussed earlier. So, if you're an accelerated filer and you want to early adopt now in your next 10Q, that would be the situation where you're doing it voluntarily. It's not required by the rule, but it's permitted.
Okay, great. Okay, and then kind of following on that question, if an issuer does early adopt of their 10K or their 10Q, do they also have to early adopt inline XBRL for their cover page tagging? Does that kind of go hand in hand?
Right. So the SEC's provided guidance here and says that no, you or issuers that voluntarily submit the inline XBRL data files or they may do cover page data tagging, but they're not required to at that point. So you don't have to do it together as a package if you don't want to. Okay.
Okay, great. And then what about an issuer that early adopts, but then changes their mind and decides that they no longer want to early adopt and they want to wait until their compliance date? What are their options?
The SEC staff confirmed this is okay. You're allowed to start and stop if you like. The other consideration I would probably note is just, kind of analyst and investor reaction to the extent they're relying on data that otherwise is no longer provided. But that's just kind of in your more IR analysis than kind of what rules require.
Okay. Okay, great. And then I'm going to go through a few questions that we've received, and let's see. We have a few more questions on the exhibits. Are you required to reference Exhibit 101 in an 8K? If so, there would always be an exhibit index. Therefore, you would always need to reference Exhibit 104.
That's the last part of the statement is correct, but the staff's guidance has said that you are permitted to, the staff won't object that if you don't already have an exhibit index in the filing, you don't have to have one just for the Exhibit 104 filing.
Okay. Okay. And then a question, do I need to tag the 8K cover page if I am not filing with Inline XBRL?
No, because I presume that the company is not otherwise subject to inline XBRL because the phase-in, they're not a large accelerated filer. So in that case, they can just wait to do the cover page tagging at the same time they would otherwise be required to do the inline XBRL.
Okay. Okay, and then on the example that we showed earlier of the, well, I can go back to that. Let's see.
On slide 9? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sorry, it's taking me back one bullet at a time.
I can appreciate how challenging these issues are. I mean, I had multiple calls with the staff, and I will note even internally there was differences of opinion on how to satisfy this obligation. I think it's just a unfortunate quirk in some of the rules and how they were written, and the Exhibit 104 is not even actually an exhibit. It's just it's more of an attachment. So.
Yeah, and I think there were just some. So the question we have is on this example for an 8K, you do not have a 101 exhibit. Thus, would you include the wording formatted as inline XBRL and contained in Exhibit 101?
So that was the example. So for an 8K, you would have essentially what I would recommend is that you would have the cover page interactive data file, and then instead of the parenthetical there format as inline XBRL contained in Exhibit 101, you would change that to say embedded within the inline XBRL document. I mean, it's not that, those aren't magic words, but that's, what some clients and other companies have been using, because the file is just embedded within the inline XBRL. You need to use the term inline XBRL because one of the instructions does say that you need to use the term inline. That's why you have inline in all the other exhibits above in the 101s, and that would also need to carry over into 104. But something kind of short and simple that gets to the point is just replacing that parenthetical with embedded within the inline XBRL document.
Right. And I'm just going to take like one more question on these. And for those questions that we don't get to, we will get to those. Okay, we will email everybody because we have everybody's email address and we know who sent the questions in. We'll go through and respond to each one. But one question we had is someone says that they're still a bit confused. The files for Exhibit 101 like the .cal, Exhibit 101.def, all show up on the Edgar page when the 8K is filed. And I think what this individual is referring to is when you go to the Edgar system and you see like all of the different, like the calc base files, the link base for calculation, for presentation, for definition, you see all of those. And the question is, do these need to be referenced in item 901? And I think, and Jay, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the reference is not on that page. It's inside the document itself, as we see here, like item 106. So it's not referenced on the Edgar page that shows all of the different files that someone has submitted. Because there's a reference there too, and so I think there's a little confusion there too. There was for me too when I first looked at this stuff.
Right, that's correct. So the 104 exhibit will not show up on just the general Edgar page for the company. You only see it when you click on the actual body of the document and go to the exhibit index, and like a 10Q and 10K, it'll be on the exhibit index. For an 8K, it may be there if there's an exhibit index already, or if there's no exhibit index, then it's just embedded within the inline XBRL filing itself.
Right. And I think part of the confusion is that Exhibit 104 is not a document. It is not like the term exhibit sort of, I think, makes us all think that it's a separate file or document, but it's really just a reference.
That's a good point, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. We have another question on requirements for 6Ks. The individual says, we're a foreign private issuer, plan to start filing inline XBRL with our Q2. And will we have to tag the cover page of our 6K that includes the financial statements?
So I'm happy to dig further on this after the call, but I don't believe that the 6K, it depends on if they're already required to file the inline XBRL, if it's a large accelerated filer and they're already on the filing schedule for compliance date. So I may want to, Michelle, we can take this one offline, and I'm happy to answer this after the call.
Sure. So what what we will do is respond to everybody's question, and then we'll post the Q&A for everyone's question, and just add that into our ongoing Q&A list that we have up on our site. So rest assured, we will make sure that we get to everybody's question. And let me just take one more question here, and then I'm going to turn over to Brian. So because we're running out of time here, but the individual says, we're a small reporting company. Can I convert to inline XBRL early and do cover page tagging on 10Q and 10Ks, but not 8Ks?
I haven't seen specific guidance from the staff on that. My assumption is yes, you could. I mean, to the extent that you you wanted guidance, you could seek out guidance from the staff, but based on the CNDI that they've addressed already, it's from the staff. The indication is that the staff is willing to allow you to early adopt and to start and stop when you like, and you don't. If you do inline XBRL, you don't obviously have to, you don't automatically have to do cover page tagging. So I think there's flexibility by the staff and the rules to allow you to kind of pick and choose what you would want to do. Brian would be the right person, like from a automation perspective, if it makes sense to have one set of procedures moving forward, because obviously this all runs through disclosure controls and procedures, and if you're setting things up for inline XBRL on kind of a start and stop, does that is that more difficult to make sure your disclosure controls and procedures are effective? But those are things that I would think about if you're not kind of going all in.
Okay, great. Okay, well, I think Jay, thanks so much. Let me just move through this quickly here. And I think we're going to go to some CPE questions, and because we're running out of time, and again, we will make sure that all of the questions are answered. But let me jump into the poll questions and start our first poll. So again, for those of you getting CPE credit, please be sure to respond here. The first question we have is, when are large accelerated filers required to comply with SEC FAST Act requirements? Is it for fiscal periods ending after June 15th, 2021, for fiscal periods ending after June 15th, 2019, or for fiscal periods ending after June 15th, 2020? So we'll give you about another 20 or 30 seconds to respond here. Okay, just a few more seconds and we'll close down this poll and go to our next question. Okay, just another 3 seconds. And I'm going to close down this poll. All right. Okay, so our second question is, which Form 8Ks require XBRL tagging for the cover page? Is it every Form 8K? Is it every Form 8K filed by an issuer subject to inline XBRL requirements? Or is it only Form 8Ks that contain financial information? This is actually relates to some of the questions we've been getting because this is all a bit confusing. Okay, just about another 30 seconds here. Okay, I'm going to close this poll down right about now. Okay, all right, thanks everybody for answering the poll questions. We're now going to switch gears a little bit and talk about more technical aspects of compliance with the FAST Act, and I'll turn it over to Brian.
Thanks, Michelle. So just a quick introduction. My name is Brian Castranis. I work at Ritchie May. I've been involved in the XBRL community for about 10 years now, providing recommendations and feedback to clients on their taxonomy selections, as well as improvements that they can make to their XBRL process and their XBRL filing to improve the completeness and accuracy, according to some of the guidance released by both the SEC and XBRL US Data Quality Consortium. So with that, I'll jump in here and talk a little bit about what this actually looks like and what some of these new data tagging requirements are. I chose a large accelerated filer who has been now required to file under the new FAST Act requirements. And just to show the difference here side by side, you can see prior to the FAST Act, there were very few data points, as Jay mentioned, that were required to be tagged on the cover page. If we contrast that with the FAST Act requirements, now there's a lot more data points that you'll see that need to be tagged within an XBRL filing. Michelle, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So the following slides I'm going to talk about were put together by NovaWorks on our last webinar, but I thought it was a good recap of what some of the new elements are that have been created so that you can meet the new tagging requirements. So here we have on the front page, we've got the quarterly report, true-false options here that weren't there before. They've created some new elements within the DEI section of the taxonomy just to accommodate the new tagging requirements. Additionally, the document type and amendment description, those have been there for a while, so nothing's changed there. But you can now tag the period end date, the document period start date and end date directly on the cover page, which was also not done previously. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, Michelle. So the new address information is shown here. The things I'll point out is that for the incorporation state country code and the entity address state or province, they did create some transformations to convert those to the respective 2-digit character codes that would correspond to those countries or those states. They did use the same set of address elements, whether you're a foreign or US filer. It's the same set of address elements that you'd be able to use to tag your location. Also, I'll point out that in situations where you're reporting a former address, the way you would handle that is that you would tag both the current and former address, but the former address would have the entity address type axis with a dimension for former address member to differentiate between the two addresses included in your filing. Next slide. Then moving on to the securities portion of the document, there are new tags there for the Security 12B title, the trading symbol, and the security exchange name. If you happen to be filing under Section 12G, there's also an option for a element there for the Security 12G title. You may have one or both, or you may have one or the other, but not both of these. Also, as it relates to the security exchange name, if you have securities that are listed on multiple exchanges, you would use the same element there, the security exchange name. But if you look over in the lower left-hand corner, the way you would handle differentiating between the exchanges is using the entity listing exchange axis. And there are predefined exchanges that you'd be able to leverage within the taxonomy to differentiate between which exchanges your securities are traded on. You also have, with the trading symbol, in the event that your securities don't have a trading symbol, there is a flag for that as well. So you would just use the no trading symbol flag with that. Next slide. All right. So the other changes here that we'll mention, particularly as it relates to the entity filer category, with the 2019 DEI taxonomy, I think the big thing to remember there is that the entity filer category no longer has the option for a smaller reporting company. And that's because they now have the entity small business true false element there that you can use to indicate that you're a smaller reporting company versus using the entity filer category. Next slide. So that's kind of a picture of the different elements that you might use to tag your filing. We'll talk about the changes to both the EFM and the DEI section of the taxonomy that were updated as part of the EDGAR update. And those are primarily in sections 6545 through 6553, which we'll cover on the subsequent slides. The important thing I think to remember here is that the 2018 DEI taxonomy didn't have a lot of these elements. So you will need to adopt the newer DEI 2019 taxonomy that was recently released in order to pick up these new elements that have been created just to comply with this new requirement. Next slide. So here's just a quick summary of the topics that we're going to cover. The new transformations, the elements that are required to be visible elements versus in the hidden section, which we've talked a little bit about hidden versus visible tagging within our previous webinars. And then the remaining sections really cover the different elements for registered securities, the new address elements, cover page elements, as well as the different ones for both a 20F versus a 40F or an 8K, because there's certain things that are specific to just those types of filings that wouldn't necessarily apply to 10Ks or 10Qs. Next slide. So some of the new transformations that were created, one that wasn't there before is a Boolean ballot box. So this is just that checkbox that indicates true, false. So they've created a transformation for you to be able to use the tagging or use the values on the screen to tag your elements. They also created a transformation for the exchange name. So the common exchange names that you would use, like the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, they've created transformations for those so that you can use those as well. I mentioned earlier the state province name and the country name. They've created transformations for those as well to convert from the actual country to the two-letter codes that are associated with those countries. And next slide, please. So 6.545, this is, as I mentioned earlier, these are the facts that would require you to tag them as visible facts versus tagging them in the hidden section. So this is purely an XBRL situation here. If you have non-empty facts, you would need to include these in a visible section for each of these elements that are listed here. This is a straight copy from the EDGAR filer manual. Next slide. So 6.546 has the new elements for the securities section that we just talked about. And we'll go through an example in just a few moments of how you would tag a situation where you have multiple types of securities listed on multiple exchanges. What you would essentially do is you're going to need to use some dimensions in order to differentiate between both the type of security and the exchange that it's listed on. Next slide. So filers with multiple securities on different exchanges will have to use dimensions to differentiate so that you're going to use the same statement, class of stock axis or class of share capital axis that you would have used in your, to differentiate between your shares on your balance sheet or on your statement of stockholders' equity. The EFM does make it clear that if you are using dimensions because you have multiple types of securities, they would not expect to see any securities that don't have a dimension. That's just one thing we wanted to point out there. Next slide. So securities that are traded on multiple exchanges, you'll have to disaggregate them using dimensions across the entity listings exchange axis. The key here is not to create your own company-specific extensions to differentiate between the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ or another exchange. You don't want to use custom ones. They are provided there in the taxonomy. So, same standard rules that apply to standard data tagging. You want to make sure that you're leveraging the structures that are there built into the taxonomy versus creating your own. Next slide. So here's the recap of the address information. So these are the new elements that were added to the DEI section to capture that address information. Once again, they're not specific to U.S. or foreign filers. Whether you're U.S. or foreign, you can leverage the same tags here to tag your address. Next slide. So the cover page elements here, because some forms serve multiple purposes, there's checkboxes on the cover page to distinguish, what is this form intended to cover. And they're primarily true, false. There's also some, the document period start date and end date. But these are there for you to tag and indicate what specifically your form is covering. Next slide. Next, these are the elements that are specific to just the 20F cover page. So the document accounting standard is whether you use US GAAP, IFRS, or some other standard. So these have a limited number of values that you're allowed to put into them. Once again, these are only going to apply to 20F filers. Next slide. So for 20F and 40F filers, there's also a requirement that there's a contact person in addition to the address. So there's some additional elements here: the contact personnel name, contact personnel fax, and contact personnel email address that would be required for a 20F or a 40F filing that wouldn't necessarily apply to a 10K or a 10Q. Next. Then, kind of sticking with the same theme, certain elements that might appear on an 8K cover page, mostly true false here as far as, whether or not you have written communications, soliciting material, pre-commencement tender offer. If those fields appear on your 8K cover page, there are a set of elements here to accommodate that in the new DEI taxonomy. As I mentioned earlier, if you do have a former address, the way you would differentiate between your current and former address is you would use the entity address type axis and indicate the former address with the former address member. You would not need to use an axis or a member for the current address. Next slide. So starting, going back to the example that I had started this section of the presentation with, wanted to give you kind of a, in line with the FASB's implementation guides, wanted to give a example of how you would tag this. So at the top, you'll see a legend that indicates the standard label and the element name that would be associated with each of these data points in a particular filing. So it's pretty straightforward with the address information. Like I said, the only thing that would really add a level of complexity to this is if you had a former address, you would have to add an axis and a member to the data points for the former address here. But otherwise, you would just use the elements to represent each of the individual data points here. Next slide. So the more complicated section, I think, for most registrants is going to be the securities registered. And to kind of help explain this, and once again, the legend up top corresponds to the letters on the bottom here. So you would use, for example, on that first line where you have a common stock at 0.625 par value with the trading symbol APA on the New York Stock Exchange, the combination of elements that you would use to tag the title of the class of stock would be element 1. So you'd use security 12B title. With axis 1, the class of stock axis, and member 1 would be common stock. So that handles that first value of common stock, 0.625 par value. Then for the trading symbol, which you would use is, oh, I'm sorry, can you go back one, Michelle? Thanks. For the trading symbol, you would use element 2, the trading symbol, with the same axis and member combinations that we just discussed. I'm sorry, you would also have to apply the axis for the entity listings exchange and use the New York Stock Exchange on that first line. So I won't go through each one of these, but you can see, I will point out that for the last line on the bottom, you can see that we've created a extended member 2, which represents that 7.75% notes due member. Where in the other cases, we tried to leverage the existing structures in the taxonomy. In this case, you would have to create a company-specific extended member to represent those notes due that have their own specific trading symbol. So hopefully this example is helpful. I think it's probably one of the more complex examples in that it has multiple types of securities, different trading symbols, and different exchanges. So you have 2 different dimensions that you need to break that information up on. The remaining data elements that we didn't cover are more or less some of the true or false items. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Michelle.
Brian, thanks very much. That was really helpful. We have a couple of questions, and as I know we're running out of time here, but oops, I forgot my CPE question slide. I do have a couple of CPE questions we have to take, and as I'm pulling those up, we did get some additional questions from the audience on the technical side. So a couple questions for you, Brian. Do some of the specific text transformations require a certain presentation? Like, for example, do they have to be lowercase? Is there a certain presentation that's required in creating a text transformation? Brian, do you know the answer to that one?
Sorry, I was on mute there.
Okay.
I don't know the answer to that one off the top of my head.
Okay. All right, we will we'll have to investigate that one, and we will get back to that that person. And okay, I think we're going to go to the poll questions now. Okay, so we're going to go to poll number 3, and I'm launching this right now. This question is: where will issuers find new cover page tagging elements? Are they in the 2019 DEI taxonomy? Are they in either the 2018 or the 2019 DEI taxonomy? Can you find them in either one? I apologize. The third one should be the 2018 US GAAP taxonomy. So is it in both, or is it in just the 2018 or the 2019? So my apologies. I incorrectly input the responses there. The last one should be 2018 US GAAP taxonomy. So if you can take a few seconds here and respond to that. So the answers are 2019 DEI, second one is 2018 or 2019 DEI, and the third 2018 DEI taxonomy. Or I'm sorry, that is 2019 US GAAP taxonomy. Sorry, I'm not even reading my answer sheet correctly. Okay, we'll take a few more seconds on this one because I'm sure I confused everyone on that. Okay, we're going to close the polling down in just a couple of minutes here. A couple seconds, rather. All right, I'm going to close the polling. And we'll go to our final poll question. How should filers with multiple securities registered on different exchanges handle the new cover page tagging requirements? Do they use new elements are available for every exchange? Must they use dimensions? Or these issuers are not required to tag securities on multiple exchanges? So which of those three responses is accurate? Okay, we'll take another 30 seconds or so here. And I'm sorry, we're running a little bit late here. Okay, so we're going to close the poll down in just about 5 seconds. So if everybody can record their answers. Okay, I just closed the polling. I want to thank everybody for joining us today for this call. And I especially want to thank Brian Castrantis from Richie May and Jay Knight from Bass Sims for their great insights and expertise on both the technical and the legal side of this kind of complicated ruling. So thanks again for everybody joining us. There are a couple of upcoming events I wanted to mention. We have an event in Naperville, Illinois, that focuses on municipal finance data. And that's really focusing on some of the big state and local initiative that we have ongoing right now. And then in the fall, we have our investor forum coming up on November 4th. This is going to be held in New York, as it always is. This time we're calling it Driving Actionable Analytics. And we're very excited to have our keynote is going to be Chairman of the FASB, Russell Golden. And we also have speakers from the SEC, from the Global Blockchain Business Council, Morgan Stanley, CFA Institute, from eBrevia, which is an artificial intelligence company. And we have a lot of interesting topics going on at that event. So please be sure to register. And we will be sending out the replay from the event, the slide deck from the event, along with links to some of the materials that we talked about here today, including I think Jay had mentioned that he has a blog that has some additional information, and we'll send that all out to you today, to tomorrow or early next week. So thanks again, and hopefully we'll see you at one of these upcoming events and at other webinars in the future. Thanks again.